Shalom. Shalom, welcome to our Codigo Able channel once again. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this time to study the Mishnah, which is the oral tradition that has come down to us, compiled in the 6 volumes of the Mishnah, but which has been passed down from mouth to mouth from teacher to disciple since the time of the biblical prophets, including Moses himself. I hope all this knowledge helps you study the biblical scriptures further, strengthen your faith, and deepen your spiritual or metaphysical knowledge, because that is, in fact, what the Mishnah is about, giving context and content to the limited ancient text, which is difficult to interpret because of how far removed we are today from the mentality and circumstances of the ancient world. This is Abel Flores, and without further ado, let us begin. Now, let's begin with the Mishnah we are to study in today's class. In Mishnah Berakhot 2.8, we read, "The groom is exempt from reciting the Shema on the first night until the end of Shabbat, if he has not consummated the act." Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, "Not everyone who wants to assume the name can assume it." This Mishnah Berakhot 2.8 has a deep and direct relationship with Mishnah 2.5, which we already studied 3 classes ago. In fact, if you haven't seen that class yet, you can go to our video playlist on our Codigo Able channel on YouTube, and there you can replay all the previously published classes. We have 2 classes per week, one on Mondays and one on Wednesdays, for this free course on the Mishnah as the key to biblical exegesis. Now, we resume. In this same chapter, 2 Mishnaic teachings appear that complement each other. Berakhot 2.5, which includes the groom's exemption from the Shema on his wedding night, and the famous story of Rabban Gamliel, which reads as follows. The groom is exempt from reciting the Shema on the first night until the end of Shabbat, if he has not consummated the act. There was a case with Rabban Gamliel who recited the Shema on the first night. He said, "I cannot annul the yoke of the kingdom of heaven for myself, even for 1 hour." But in the Mishnah we study today, in Berakhot 2.8, there is permission to recite the Shema on your wedding night, in contrast to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's objection. Berakhot 2.8 says, with regard to the Shema on the first night, if the groom wishes to read it, let him read it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, not everyone who wishes to take the name may take it. In this Mishnah of Berakhot 2.8, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is quoted as saying that not everyone may take the name. Rabbinic literature after the Mishnah explains that this means that not everyone can impose strict piety on themselves when the regulations or halacha exempt them from doing so, for fear of yukara, that is, ostentation, such as showing off something they're not. However, a gadol, that is, one of the greats of the generation who can maintain full kavanah, or the proper intention of the heart, and does not act out of ostentation or a pedagogical context, does not contradict the principle. This is how various Mefarshim or interpreters, such as Rambam Maimonides, understand this Mishnah in his formulation of the Mishnah Torah when he studies and comments on this Mishnah in Berakhot 2.8. That is, human beings should not take on a burden heavier than they can bear. This is basically what we are being told. Above all, or even worse, if you are taking on that heavier burden or obligation in your actions for show, to make others speak more highly of you, to show yourself superior or with a better reputation. Rabban Gamliel is teaching you here that not everyone can take on a chumrah or a greater burden in fulfilling the Torah. Or, as the title of this video says, with a very famous phrase we use a lot in Latin America, don't be more papist than the Pope. The pair of Mishnah at 2.5 and 2.8 offers a balance. The law dispenses by turda, which in Hebrew means concern for a mitzvah when you meet your wife on your wedding night, and thus the exception of not reciting the Shema that night for not having the appropriate kavanah or intention of the heart. But this is a rabbinic ruling, that is, a protective fence around the Torah so that the anxious and worried groom does not recite the Shema with the name of God in vain, because it is a sin to name or use the name of God in vain. You have to understand that this is the projection fence that the rabbis of that time legislated as a halacha, technically a gezerah, which is a negative decree, meaning you shall not do something, to protect the Torah. In this case, which has been explained many times, The rabbis are protecting the groom from the obligation to recite the Shema on his wedding night so that he doesn't take God's name in vain by having thoughts or worries that don't help him concentrate with the true and pure intention of his heart when reciting the Shema, taking God's name in vain, which is a grave sin. But Gamliel says in the previous Mishnah that he did recite the Shema on his wedding night, which we now know was his second wedding, and he was already an old man who controlled his emotions, feelings, and actions much better than a young first-time groom. But the great lesson here is that this chamra, or heavier burden, must be assumed only out of love for the Torah and out of respect and honor for the kingdom of heaven. Gamliel assumed this heavier burden only for himself, not for others. This is why he taught his disciples in the Mishnah not to recite the Shema on their wedding night, like all the wise shachamim of his generation, because the heaviest burdens, as long as they are carried out of love and not for ostentation, are assumed exclusively in one's private life. The religious ethics taught in this Mishnah prevent a person from constructing an exaggerated pose of piety when the Torah does not require it, but rather the commandment of man, that is, rabbinic regulations, require it. That's why we teach that Rabban Gamliel was strict with the Shema, because it's a mitzvah or commandment of the Torah, even among the 10 commandments. Although the rabbinic regulation was to be exempt that night because he was worried or nervous about having relations with his bride. Rabban Gamliel is teaching you that when the commandment is from the Torah, you should be cautious and do your best. But when the regulation is rabbinic, that is, a Torah fence, then don't suffer or exaggerate in fulfilling it, because it's only a protective fence so that you don't violate an important Torah commandment. And this is precisely the teaching or Mishnah from last class where Rabban Gamliel bathes on the first night of the week of mourning, because that prohibition was rabbinic and he was already an old and weak man and needed to bathe. Please understand the context of the ancient world, perhaps a boy between 15 and 18 years old, as was the marriageable age at that time, who possibly had never had sexual relations with any woman, and who perhaps had never seen a naked woman, and whose bride was probably a virgin who had never seen a naked man. In that context, there are nerves, worry, and grief, so the mind is not prepared for true and pure faith and kavanah to recite the most important commandment, the Shema. So, as we repeat so many times, because ultimately, this is the crux of the matter, the rabbis of the Second Temple and Mishnah eras legislated a fence around the Torah, exempting themselves from reading the Shema on your wedding night. You are exempt because you do not have the proper kavanah or intention of the heart, and reciting the Shema under those conditions is a grave sin, taking God's name in vain. But Rabban Gamliel says that because the Shema is a commandment of the Torah, he did recite the Shema on his wedding day, but it was because he could do so, because of his holiness and spiritual level, even because of his advanced age where he controlled his emotions and actions. It is said that on his wedding night, it was his second wedding, having become a widower, and he was not marrying a virgin either, but a widow. So, both were not first-timers, and in that context, he, Rabban Gamliel, was able to keep the commandment of the Torah above the restriction of rabbinic regulations, which are laws of men. However, Rabban Gamliel assumed a strict burden in the Torah, but he taught his disciples a less strict rule, because heavy burdens are assumed in one's private life, and they are not taught, much less legislated, for others. This is similar to the teaching of Jesus or Yeshua, who says to first see the plank in your own eye before seeing the speck in the eye of others. Much less impose heavy burdens on others, you must first impose them on yourself, as Gamliel did. Now that we have explained several times the topic of the commandments of the Torah and the commandments of men or rabbinic regulations as fences to protect and fulfill the commandments or mitzvah of the Torah, let's delve into a topic that is now time to understand. The chumad in Judaism in Hebrew, chamra, literally means strictness or rigor. In the halakhic realm, it designates a stricter practice than that required by the minimal law, which is the norm or halacha, and this strictness in fulfilling the biblical commandments is discussed or required for several reasons. The first is precautionary, to avoid a possible transgression. For example, so that you wouldn't recite the Shema without the proper motivation, which could be taking God's name in vain. The rabbis of the Second Temple period decreed a negative rule, that is, a gezerah, for the groom not to recite the Shema on his wedding night. But this is a rabbinic regulation to avoid reciting the Shema without kavanah or without the proper intention, thus keeping the groom from sinning that night. And this could be a sin of using God's name in vain, a violation of the 10 Commandments, as we have said several times in this class. But there's a second reason for taking on Tumrad, personal devotion, an expression of Yirat Shamayim, or awe of the heavens. An example of this is the wearing of the kippah, which is a rabbinic norm requiring every Jew to dress in a certain spiritual way, like wearing a kippah, which is a rabbinic norm, not a Torah norm, or dressing in black and white, as many Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox groups do today to commemorate the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. None of this is in the Torah of Moses, but they are laws of men, that is, stricter rabbinic regulations that are optional, but not required by the Torah, in case you didn't know. There's also a third reason for taking on Tumrad, and that is the communal tradition. That is, of the community where you were born or live, their customs adopted as the norm in certain groups. Here the issue becomes very complicated because from the time of the Mishnah, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, until today, 18 centuries have passed and hundreds or thousands of customs have become law, that is, norms. That's why today's Judaism is very, very different from the Judaism of the Mishnah. One custom, for example, is not to eat fish and cheese at the same time, due to the commandment not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. This didn't occur in biblical or Mishnaic times, when the only custom was not to eat any dairy product with beef or chicken, for example. But many traditional or Orthodox communities began not to eat any dairy product with any fish at the same meal, and then those customs or traditions became law, that is, norms, not out of devotion, but out of custom, tradition. All of this began, relatively speaking, in Judaism in the 16th century, with the Shulchan Aruch and the entire Kabbalah of the Arizal. You should know that normative Judaism is only 5 centuries old, dating back to the 16th century, as we have said so many times. However, we emphasize this so that you understand that in life the only constant is change, and that keeping the precepts or mitzvot of the Torah has been different in each generation, but the Torah provides the legal framework to make all of this possible. However, up to this point in this course, we have not yet asked this question. What is the basis for the Torah's fences? In the Mishnah itself, in Tractate Perkei Avot 1.1, which is a tractate we will study in this course when the time comes, it says the following: make a fence around the Torah. This is obviously a teaching that comes from the time of the prophet Moses himself. In fact, tradition believes it to be a direct teaching from Moses, that is, these are the literal words of Moses addressed especially to the judges, the rabbis, the people with authority in the people, in the community. It is not a law for the ordinary citizen, it is for the judges of Israel. This is why, in the Mishnah we are studying in Bereshot, with the 4 Mishnayot that speak of the teachings of Rabban Gamliel, we are told about these things, because Rabban Gamliel was the great, the wise gadol of his generation and president of the Sanhedrin. He had the authority to legislate, that is, to bind and loose regulations to protect the people's fulfillment of the Torah. Now, let's give Talmudic examples of fences around the Torah, known as gezerot, which are negative regulations, that is, not doing something as we already mentioned. There is the rabbinic prohibition or regulation against eating poultry with milk. Although the Torah of Moses only prohibits mammal meat with milk, as the Talmud says in Chulin 113a. There is also the prohibition against handling a muksa on Shabbat as a protective measure. A muksa is a tool or object that the rabbis are forbidden to use, even touching, on Shabbat, so that you won't be tempted or mistakenly violate a precept or commandment of Shabbat. Want an example? On Shabbat, the Torah prohibits lighting a fire, so the rabbis prohibited picking up or even touching a lighter or matches to protect you from, under any circumstances, even through neglect of your daily routine during the week, starting a fire on Shabbat. Individual chumrah differs from collective rabbinic decrees. The former is voluntary and personal, the latter are binding on all. This distinction was basically established in the 16th century because today's Judaism is more similar to that of the 16th century and very different from the Judaism of the Second Temple during the Mishnah, which is the 1st and 2nd centuries. What is the classification of chumrot, or strictures in fulfilling the Torah? There is a chumrah of protection. These are adopted to avoid falling into an error that would lead to transgressing halacha. Example: not eating bread baked by a non-Jew, tadakum, even if technically it would be permissible. This is to prevent eating non-kosher food or food not permitted by the Torah, but this is a rabbinic regulation, not a commandment of Moses. You've surely read many things in the New Testament that talk about this, about not eating with Gentiles and things like that, and basically what is being discussed is this: the difference between the commandments of the Torah and the rabbinic regulations for not violating those commandments. It is also studied that there is a chumrah of devotion. These are acts that seek to elevate personal holiness beyond the minimum obligation. For example, praying longer or including more psalms in the daily prayer. Today, the Siddur, or prayer book, being a product of 16th century Judaism, is full of prayers, psalms, and meditations that were added because customs became law, as you can never forget if you live or study Judaism today. But in the 1st and 2nd centuries, or during the Second Temple period, this wasn't the case. Therefore, when we study the historical Jesus, the context we must keep in mind is the Tannaitic Judaism of the Mishnah, not the modern Judaism based on or founded on the Shulchan Aruch. And third, the chumrah, or the rigor of your community. These are traditions or customs adopted by entire communities as a religious identity. For example, there is the Ashkenazi prohibition of kitniyot on Pesach. That is, Ashkenazis do not eat legumes, grains such as rice and corn, or seeds such as sunflower and sesame during Pesach or Passover. Although kitniyot are not chomets or leavened bread, the leavened bread prohibited during Pesach, many Ashkenazi communities in Central and Eastern Europe have the custom of not eating kitniyot because they are harvested and processed similarly to chomets grains. This was a minhag custom that became law, that is, a gezira, but Sephardic communities do eat grains during Passover, just as in the time of the Mishnah, when grains were eaten during Pesach. Today in Israel, where Orthodox communities of both Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities coexist in the same city, such as Jerusalem, for example, what regulation should be followed if one cannot have chomets or yeast in the land of Israel during Passover? So the regulation followed throughout Israel is the Ashkenazi one because it is stricter. That is, Sephardim who live or are celebrating Passover in Israel are obligatorily bound to the Ashkenazi tradition in Israel. However, the debates to this day on these matters are very complicated. We will study all of this when we get to the tractate of Pesachim in the Mishnah. Don't worry, rather enjoy and delve deeper into the topics we study because the Mishnah is a very complete encyclopedia of all ancient knowledge that provides the correct tools for interpreting the Torah. But there is also a chumrah, or circumstantial rigor. What does this refer to? The chumrah applied in cases of halakhic doubt, safek in Hebrew. Example: in matters of liturgical purity, the strictest opinion must be followed when there is rabbinic debate, because the laws of purity and impurity originate from the Oreda, that is, from the Torah of Moses. Now, having reached this point, we can ask the following question: what is the philosophy behind the chumrot? And we answer: positive chumrot. They express a longing for closeness to God. They generate spiritual discipline and prevent inadvertent transgressions. But negative chumrot can transform into yuhara, spiritual pride, boasting of being superior to others. They run the risk of presenting a custom as a binding law. If exaggerated, they turn the Torah into something burdensome and distant rather than bring people closer. They create social division between those who observe the Jumrah and those who don't. They divide the community, and this is very serious. No. What do the great sages of history think about chumrot? Maimonides, for example, Rambam, says in the Mishnah Torah that he recognizes the value of protective hedges, but criticizes their excess. Maimonides is a very famous sage as a jurist, interpreter, physician, and rational Kabbalist, and above all, he is famous for teaching balance, always finding a middle ground, or at least trying to. In his work Hilchot Diet 3:1, Maimonides in the 12th century teaches that one should seek the middle path and not incline to unnecessary extremes. In his commentary on the Talmud, Berakhot 17b and 28b, he warns against feigning more piety than required. Not everyone who wishes to take the name can take it. Berakhot 16b, Rabban Shimon then Gamliel. Rav Moshe Feinstein, 20th century, essentially the most famous jurist in modern Judaism, affirms that chumrot are valid if they do not humiliate others or displace essential halacha. The Chafetz Haim, in his Mishnah Berakhot, recognizes the practice of some chumrot, but emphasizes that they should not be confused with obligatory halacha. They are optional and never imposed on the community. So, what is the contemporary rabbinic debate? In the modern era, where we live today and where normative Judaism, which is dominant today, comes from, with broad access to texts and a diversity of rabbinic opinions, chumrah can be seen in the following ways: as a spiritual luxury, or personal expression of piety, or as an unnecessary burden that hinders the experience of the Torah. What is the difference? Well, the same difference that Gamliel taught us. When the commandment is from the Torah, one must be very strict, with rigor, with chumrah, and when it is a human commandment or a regulation, one must be less strict when it entails suffering, and one must not impose it on anyone other than oneself. Many modern poskim advise, that is, as you heard, they advise, not impose, respect the chumrah of the community to which you belong. This is specifically speaking of Orthodox groups, not of liberal communities, which obviously have customs but not chumrah. Avoiding imposing chumrah on others is key and is fundamentally the teaching of Mishnah Berakhot 2.8. This is the main teaching of this Mishnah spoken by Rabban Shimon then Gamliel. Do not confuse chumrah with strict halacha, because they are regulations made by man, that is, by the rabbis. They are not the commandments of the prophet Moses. Here lies a key to the principle of balance in your spiritual life. The Torah was given to be lived, not to be an unbearable burden, says the Yerushalmi Talmud in Berakhot. Tradition recognizes the value of chumrah, but also reminds us that the essence lies in basic, simple halacha. Keep it simple. The sages have said many times throughout history. The true merit of a chumrah depends on the intention. If it is born of love and humility, it enriches. If it is born of pride, it corrupts, and worse, it alienates the little ones from the Torah, which is a great sin in the Torah of Moses. What is the conclusion of today's class? Chumrah are an inevitable dimension of the life of anyone who wants to live Judaism and the Torah, a product of the tension between the minimum obligatory law and personal or communal devotion. They are tools of spiritual elevation, provided they are adopted with humility and in their true context. Not everyone who wants to perform chumrah can do so. It is not those who want to, but those who can. This is fundamentally what Rabban Gamliel teaches. But chumrah can also become traps of arrogance if they become absolute rules or causes of division within the community, even within the family. It can lead the small person, that is, one with an uneducated or undeveloped spirit, to live in hypocrisy. Classical or traditional Judaism, which is what we study in the Mishnah, teaches that the correct measure is one that balances fidelity to halacha with openness to a variety of pious practices. That is, if you are sure you can do it, do more than you should do it, but don't impose it on others. Impose it on yourself. Now, to conclude, and as we always say, if you are a Christian or want to understand early Christianity or proto-Christianity as the Judaism of Jesus or Yeshua and his apostles is known academically, you must study the Mishnah, because it is precisely the context of that past that we no longer see, but we can read about the little or much that survived from that time. There are several teachings of Jesus in the Gospels that align with this idea of balance between the essential norm and devotional practices, especially with the admonition against imposing extra burdens on others. Of course, who in Judaism can impose burdens on others? The Sanhedrin and Yeshua spoke about this to the judges, not to the people. For example, in Matthew 23 verse 4, Jesus criticizes certain Pharisees and scribes, saying, "They bind heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, and they themselves are not willing to move them with one of their fingers." Here, he emphasizes that it is not wrong to be personally rigorous, but it becomes hypocritical when one imposes on others what one does not hold with integrity, which is basically what Gamliel is teaching in today's Mishnah. So, we now know that the Pharisees Jesus is criticizing are Shammai's disciples. Inner purity over outer purity is one of his teachings in Mark chapter 7:6. 8. These people honor me with their lips, speaking of God, but their hearts are far from me, because they have abandoned the commandment of God, the Torah of Moses, and have held to human tradition. There is also the rule of personal fasting in Matthew 6 verses 16 to 18, which is another example. When you fast, do not be sober like the hypocrites. When you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting may not be seen by others, but only by your Father who is in secret. That's it for today's class. See you in the next video.